Try something for me right now. Swallow. Just swallow, 3 times in a row, nothing in your mouth. No water. No food. Go ahead. I'll wait. Some of you just did that without thinking twice. Easy. Automatic. 4 million people in America, that's not automatic. That's the fight they lose every single day. Their mouths are so dry, they physically cannot get through that 3 times in a row without water in reach. Some can't do it once. And for most of them, it took 3 to 5 years, some cases over a decade, before a doctor finally said the words, "I think I know what's wrong with you." Not because the disease is rare. It's the second most common autoimmune disease on the planet. It's because, for almost 100 years, doctors were taught to treat this as an inconvenience. A footnote. Dry eyes, dry mouth, here's some eye drops. Meanwhile, inside these patients' bodies, their own immune system was quietly attacking their glands, their joints, their nerves, sometimes their lungs and kidneys. Today, that story is changing. Not slowly. Fast. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 3 things. Why this disease was ignored for a century. Why doctors just changed its name, and what that name change is really about. And why, after decades of nothing, there are now 6 new drugs in clinical trials, 2 of which just posted the kind of results researchers spend entire careers hoping to see. This is the story of Sjögren's disease. If you keep leaving appointments remembering symptoms you forgot to mention, I made a Sjögren's symptom map to help you track the full pattern. Comment symptom map, and I'll send it to you. Let's start with a name you've probably never heard correctly pronounced. Sjögren's, SJÖGREN'S. Named after Henrik Sjögren, a Swedish ophthalmologist who first described it in 1933. He noticed a group of women with unusually dry eyes, dry mouths, and arthritis. He wrote it up. He was mostly ignored. Fast forward almost a century, and here's where we are. Sjögren's disease affects somewhere between 1 in 101 in 200 people. That's more common than rheumatoid arthritis, more common than lupus, more common than multiple sclerosis. And 9 out of 10 patients diagnosed are women, usually between 30 and 60 years old. Here's what actually happens in the body. Your immune system is supposed to be a defense force. It identifies threats, foreign invaders, and destroys them. In Sjögren's, that defense force gets confused. It starts treating your own moisture-producing glands, your tear ducts, your salivary glands, as the enemy. White blood cells flood in and slowly, over years, destroy the tissue that keeps your eyes and mouth wet. But, and this is the part almost nobody knows, it doesn't stop there. For a huge percentage of patients, the disease goes systemic. It doesn't just dry you out. It can inflame your joints. Cause crushing fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep. Attack peripheral nerves, causing burning or numbness. Affect the lungs, the kidneys, the thyroid. And patients with Sjögren's carry a meaningfully elevated lifetime risk of developing a specific type of lymphoma, a cancer of the immune system itself. So why did it take a century for anyone to take this seriously? A few brutal, honest reasons. Reason 1. The symptoms sound mundane when you say them out loud. My eyes are dry. My mouth is dry. I'm tired. Doctors hear that and think allergies, menopause, stress, aging, not autoimmune disease. One rheumatologist described it to researchers as the most underrecognized major autoimmune disease in medicine, because the symptoms are so easy to write off. Reason 2. It's a disease that mostly affects women in their 40s and 50s, and there's a long, well-documented history in medicine of women's pain and fatigue being dismissed, minimized, or attributed to psychological causes rather than investigated. Reason 3. There was no financial incentive. Pharmaceutical companies invest where there's a clear, approvable drug pathway. And until very recently, there wasn't one. No approved disease-modifying therapy existed. Doctors could treat the dryness with drops and rinses. They had almost nothing for the underlying disease itself. Put those 3 things together, and you get the reality patients describe: years of being told it's just dry eye. Being sent to 5 different specialists before anyone connects the dots. Being told, sometimes explicitly, that it's anxiety. A 2025 patient survey from the Sjögren's Foundation confirmed what patients have said for years: the disease's biggest quality of life impact isn't even the dryness. It's the fatigue, the chronic pain, and the neurocognitive fog, the symptoms that don't show up on a checklist, and that doctors are least equipped to explain or treat. That's the world this disease has existed in for 90 years. Let me make this concrete, because statistics can feel abstract until you sit with what they actually mean day to day. Imagine waking up and the first thing you do, before coffee, before anything, is reach for eye drops, because your eyes have been open for 4 seconds and they already feel like they're being scraped. Imagine every meal requiring a glass of water within arm's reach, not because you are thirsty, but because without it, you physically cannot swallow dry food. Imagine dental visits every few months instead of every year, because without adequate saliva, which is one of the body's main defenses against tooth decay, your teeth begin breaking down in a way that has nothing to do with how well you brush. Now imagine describing all of that to a doctor, multiple doctors, over multiple years, and being told it's probably just dehydration. Or aging. Or, in more cases than anyone wants to admit, being told it might be in your head. That's not a hypothetical. That's the average documented experience for people who eventually get diagnosed with this disease. And eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because the average diagnostic delay isn't measured in weeks. It's measured in years, and in the number of specialists a patient has to cycle through before someone connects dry eyes, dry mouth, joint pain, and crushing fatigue into a single diagnosis. Now, here's where it starts to change. In the last year, something quiet but significant happened in the medical literature. An international group of experts, physicians, researchers, and patient representatives together, published a formal consensus statement. They agreed to stop calling it Sjögren's syndrome. From now on, the recommendation is Sjögren's disease. Now, on the surface, that sounds like semantics. Who cares what word comes after the name? Here's why it actually matters. A syndrome, in medical language, implies a collection of symptoms, a pattern you can observe, without necessarily a single, well-defined disease mechanism behind it. It sounds soft. It sounds like a description, not a diagnosis. A disease implies something more concrete, a defined pathological process, with mechanisms, with a course, with, crucially, the expectation that it can and should be treated directly, not just managed symptomatically. This is not the first time language has done this kind of work in medicine. Renaming things has, historically, preceded, or accompanied, a shift in how seriously a condition gets funded, researched, and treated. When a condition gets treated as real by the language doctors use, it becomes easier to justify clinical trial investment, insurance coverage, and drug development pathways built specifically around it. So when an international consensus group takes the step of formally retiring syndrome in favor of disease, what they are really doing is making a statement. This is not a vague cluster of complaints. This is a defined, serious, systemic autoimmune disease that deserves the same treatment infrastructure as rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. And that statement didn't come out of nowhere. It came after years of researchers mapping the disease at a molecular level using something called omics, genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics, high-throughput technologies that let scientists look at thousands of genes and proteins at once, rather than testing one hypothesis at a time. What that research found: distinct immune signaling pathways driving different patients' disease. Different patient subtypes that respond differently to different mechanisms of treatment. In other words, Sjögren's isn't one disease. It's a family of related immune malfunctions that all produce a similar clinical picture. And once you can define those subtypes molecularly, you can start designing drugs that target them specifically, rather than throwing broad immunosuppressants at everyone and hoping. That single insight, that this disease can be stratified, subtyped, and targeted, is the scientific foundation underneath everything I'm about to tell you next. Here is the sentence that should stop you. As of the start of this year, there has never been a single FDA-approved medication that treats the underlying disease process of Sjögren's. Not one. Every treatment patients have used for decades, eye drops, saliva substitutes, off-label immunosuppressants borrowed from other diseases, treats symptoms. None of it touches the disease itself. That is about to change, and it's happening faster than most people in the patient community expected even 2 years ago. Let's go through what's actually in the pipeline, because this is where the story stops being about neglect and starts being about a genuine turning point. Ianalumab. This is, right now, the furthest along and the most talked about candidate. It's a monoclonal antibody, engineered to do two things simultaneously. First, It depletes B cells, the immune cells responsible for producing the autoantibodies that drive the disease. Second, it blocks a receptor called BAFF, which B cells need in order to survive and multiply. So it's not just clearing out the problem cells, it's cutting off their ability to regenerate. In January 2026, the FDA granted ianalumab breakthrough therapy designation, a status reserved for treatments that show substantial improvement over existing options for serious conditions. That designation doesn't get handed out casually. It was awarded on the strength of Phase 3 data, and the company behind it has said it plans to begin filing for global regulatory approval this year. If it's approved, ianalumab would become the first targeted treatment ever specifically approved for Sjögren's disease. Not adapted from lupus. Not borrowed from rheumatoid arthritis. Built for this. Telitacicept. Running right alongside it. A Phase 3 trial involving 381 patients showed statistically significant reductions in disease activity, measured using a scoring system called the ESSDAI, which rheumatologists use to track how much the disease is affecting a patient's organs and systems, at both the higher and lower doses tested, compared to placebo. And the improvements weren't just numbers on a chart, they showed up in patient-reported measures too, how patients said they actually felt. That data was strong enough that the manufacturer has already filed for approval in China, and a separate global trial has now started dosing patients in the United States. Nipocalimab. A different mechanism entirely, it targets something called the neonatal Fc receptor, or FcRn, which the body uses to recycle antibodies and keep them circulating longer. Block that receptor, and you accelerate the clearance of the harmful autoantibodies driving the disease. In trials, nipocalimab didn't just reduce disease activity scores, it produced measurable, dose-dependent drops in the actual autoantibodies associated with Sjögren's. That's a rare thing in autoimmune research, a drug that you can watch working, in real time, in a blood test. Remibrutinib. A smaller Phase 2 trial, but one worth knowing about, because of what it targets, a signaling enzyme inside immune cells called BTK. Blocking it interrupts the immune activation cascade before it even gets going. In this trial, disease activity scores improved significantly against placebo, and a specific inflammatory marker called CXCL13 dropped by roughly 50%, a marker researchers watch closely because it correlates with how active the immune attack is inside affected glands and tissue. And underneath all of these newer candidates, there's still rituximab, an older anti-CD20 antibody that depletes B cells more broadly. It's not new, but it remains one of the most evidence-backed options currently used off-label, and it's part of the reason researchers became confident that targeting B cells was the right strategy in the first place. Put all of that together, and here's the headline that matters. At a major continuing medical education conference for Sjögren's specialists earlier this year, presenters walked through 6 separate drugs currently in active clinical trials, and said, on record, that they expect at least one of them to reach FDA approval soon. For a disease that has had 0 approved disease-modifying treatments for its entire 90-year documented history, that is not an incremental update. That's the beginning of an entirely new era of care. Let's zoom out for a second, because I think the pattern here is as important as any single drug. Notice that these 4 candidates, ianalumab, telitacicept, nipocalimab, and remibrutinib, attack the disease through 4 genuinely different mechanisms. One depletes B cells directly. One cuts off the survival signal those cells need. One accelerates the clearance of harmful antibodies already in circulation. One interrupts the internal signaling that activates immune cells in the first place. That diversity isn't an accident, and it isn't researchers throwing darts at a board. It's the direct product of that omics mapping work I mentioned earlier, the molecular subtyping that lets scientists identify multiple distinct pathways driving this disease in different patients. A decade ago, researchers were still debating whether Sjögren's even had clear enough biological mechanisms to design a targeted drug around. Today, there are 4 independent mechanisms in Phase 2 or Phase 3 testing simultaneously. That's what happens when the underlying science actually catches up to a disease that's been recognized for 90 years but understood for barely 15. And there's a second reason this matters beyond the drugs themselves: competition drives urgency. When Novartis, Regen, and other companies are racing toward the same regulatory finish line with different mechanisms, that tends to accelerate timelines industry-wide, because nobody wants to be the company still running Phase 2 trials while a competitor's drug is already reaching patients. For a disease that spent 90 years with almost no pharmaceutical investment at all, having multiple companies compete for the same approval is, in itself, a signal of how much the perception of this disease has shifted inside the industry. Now here's the part of this story that sounds almost like science fiction, and it's happening quietly, out of a hospital in Wisconsin. Remember what actually happens in this disease. The immune system doesn't just misbehave, it destroys glandular tissue. The salivary glands themselves get damaged, sometimes severely, sometimes permanently. All the drugs I just walked you through are designed to stop the attack. None of them regrow what's already been lost. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin's program for advanced cell therapy are working on something different. A cell therapy specifically designed to treat severe dry mouth, xerostomia, by addressing the damaged gland tissue directly, rather than just calming the immune system around it. It's early. It's currently in what's called a Phase 0 trial, the earliest, smallest, most exploratory stage of human testing, designed mainly to confirm a therapy behaves the way researchers expect before larger trials begin. But it was significant enough that the FDA granted it Fast Track designation, a status meant to speed up development and review for therapies addressing a serious, unmet medical need. Right now, researchers say it's the only therapy of its kind being tested in the United States for this specific problem. Is it close to patients? No. Phase 0 is early. There's a long road of Phase 1, 2, and 3 trials ahead before anyone could actually receive this as an approved treatment. But it represents a fundamentally different philosophy, not just stopping the disease, but repairing what it's already taken. That's a door that, until very recently, nobody thought was even worth trying to open. Now let me be straight with you, because it would be easy to end this video by making it sound like a cure is around the corner. It's not. I want to be precise about what's real here and what isn't. None of these drugs are approved yet. Breakthrough therapy designation and positive Phase 3 data are enormous milestones, but they are not the same as an FDA approval sitting on a pharmacy shelf. Regulatory review still takes time. Some of these candidates may still fail to clear that final bar, or may end up approved only for specific patient subgroups. The cell therapy work out of Wisconsin is years away from being anything a patient could actually receive, if it ever gets there at all. And even once a drug like ianalumab or telitacicept is approved, it won't be a cure. Based on the trial data so far, these are treatments that meaningfully reduce disease activity and improve how patients feel, not treatments that reverse the disease or restore what's already been damaged. But here's why, even with all of those caveats, this moment is genuinely different from every other moment in this disease's history. For the first time, there is mechanistic, targeted science behind Sjögren's treatment, not repurposed drugs from other diseases, but molecules built specifically around what researchers now understand is actually happening in these patients' immune systems. For the first time, there's real momentum, multiple companies, multiple mechanisms, multiple Phase 3 successes, in the same 18-month window. For the first time, the disease has a name that reflects how seriously the medical establishment says it should be taken. If you know someone who has spent years being told their exhaustion is just stress, or their dry eyes are just allergies, or their joint pain is probably nothing, this is the context they need. Not false hope. Real, documented, first-of-its-kind progress, after a century of almost none. There's also a practical takeaway buried in all of this, for anyone watching who suspects they might have symptoms like the ones I've described. Diagnostic delay has historically been one of the biggest failures in this disease's history, not because the tests don't exist, but because nobody thought to order them. A simple blood test for specific antibodies, alongside an eye exam measuring tear production and a small lip biopsy examining salivary gland tissue, can confirm a diagnosis that might otherwise take years to reach. If any of what I've described in this video sounds familiar, persistent dry eyes and mouth, unexplained fatigue, joint pain that doesn't have an obvious cause, that combination is worth raising directly with a doctor, and specifically worth asking whether it could be Sjögren's, by name. Patients who advocate for themselves and name the possibility directly tend to get diagnosed faster than those who wait for a doctor to make the connection unprompted, a sad but well-documented reality of how underrecognized this disease still is, even today. Here's what I keep coming back to with this story. It's not really about a drug, or a name change, or a clinical trial number. It's about what happens when a disease that mostly affects women, that mostly produces symptoms doctors are trained to dismiss, finally gets the same scientific seriousness that other major autoimmune diseases have had for decades. It took 90 years. It's happening now. If you found this useful, if you or someone you know has spent years chasing a diagnosis that nobody could quite name, share this video with them. Not because it's a cure. Because it's proof that the story is finally moving. I'll see you in the next one.